An upright bass and an unsolvable problem. To understand what Everett Hull built, you first have to understand the problem he was trying to solve. In the late 1940s, if you were a jazz bassist, if you played an upright double bass in a small New York club, in a hotel ballroom, in a dance hall where the crowd pressed against the stage, and the band had to compete with the clink of glasses and the low roar of conversation, you had a fundamental problem. Your instrument could not be heard. The double bass is a physical instrument. Its resonance comes from the vibration of a large wooden body, two chambers of air moving against each other to produce the low-frequency sound that a bassist's fingers draw from the strings. In a small room with perfect acoustics and a quiet audience, it projects beautifully. But jazz was not played in quiet rooms for quiet audiences. It was played in smoky, crowded, loud spaces where a piano could hold its own and a horn section could cut through anything, and the bass disappeared into the background noise like a stone dropped into a river. The microphone offered a partial solution. You could place a microphone near the body of the bass and amplify the signal through the PA. But microphones introduced problems of their own. Feedback was constant. The amplified signal would leak back into the microphone and create a howling loop. The microphone picked up everything: the shuffle of feet, the rumble of the HVAC system, the ambient noise of the room. And the microphone had to be positioned perfectly, which meant that every time a bassist moved, the balance changed. Everett Hull was not an electronics engineer by training. He was a working musician. He played the upright bass in New York in the years after the Second World War, making a living doing what working musicians do, taking the jobs that were available, playing the music that was wanted, and thinking about the technical problems that nobody in the music industry seemed interested in solving. He had a specific idea. Instead of capturing the sound that came out of the instrument after it had traveled through the air, which was the microphone approach, he wanted to capture the vibration at the source. He wanted to pick up the movement of the strings and the resonance of the body before it ever left the wood. If you could do that, you could eliminate the feedback problem entirely. The amplified signal would come from inside the instrument, not from the room. The question was where to attach such a device to a double bass. The body of the instrument was too large, too resonant, too complex. The strings themselves vibrated at frequencies too high to represent the full spectrum of the bass sound. But there was one point on the instrument where all the vibration of the strings converged into a single moving element. That point was the end pin, the removable wooden peg that fit into a hole at the bottom of the bass and supported the instrument's weight against the floor. In the language of the instrument, this was simply called the peg. Hull designed an electromagnetic pickup small enough to be embedded in a modified version of that peg. The device detected the physical vibration of the instrument at its structural center and converted it into an electrical signal that could be amplified cleanly, without feedback, without ambient noise, without the vulnerability of a microphone sitting in open air. He called it the amplified peg. He called it the Ampeg. That name, carved out of two words so simple they are almost invisible, would eventually appear on more bass amplifiers than any other name in the history of American music. But in 1946, in the small apartment where Hull first assembled his prototype, it was just a solution to a specific problem that a working bassist had been carrying around in his head for years. The founding, Michaels Hull Electronic Labs. In 1946, Everett Hull and a partner named Stanley Michaels founded a company in New York City. They called it Michaels Hull Electronic Labs, and their first product was the pickup that Hull had designed, the Ampeg. It was not a glamorous origin. There was no investment capital, no venture backing, no business plan in the modern sense. There was a musician who had built something that worked and a partner who believed there was a market for it. The market was other upright bassists. The initial product was the pickup itself, which could be installed on any existing double bass. The pitch was straightforward. Here is a device that will let you be heard in any room, without feedback, without the problems of a microphone. It is built to the specific physics of your instrument. It works. Hull was not wrong. The pickup was well designed and genuinely effective. In the tight community of New York working musicians, word spread. Other bassists tried it. They liked it. They bought it. But selling pickups to upright bassists was, in the long run, a limited business. Hull understood that the pickup was only half of the solution. If you were going to amplify the bass signal, you needed something to amplify it through. You needed an amplifier designed for the specific frequency range and dynamic character of the bass. The guitar amplifiers that were becoming increasingly common by the late 1940s were not designed with bass in mind. They emphasized mid-range frequencies where guitars lived. They were not built to handle the sustained low-frequency energy that a bass demanded without distortion, without the cabinet breaking up under the load. Hull's answer was to build an amplifier himself, one designed specifically for bass. And in doing so, he stepped from the world of accessories into the world of instruments. He was no longer making a peripheral device that plugged into someone else's system. He was building the system itself. The Ampeg Bass Amp Company. By 1949, Hull had bought out Stanley Michaels and renamed the company the Ampeg Bass Amp Company. The name was accurate. These were amplifiers built for bass. The word bass was in the company name. At a time when no major amplifier manufacturer had considered bass players a significant enough market to address directly, Hull had oriented his entire business around their specific needs. The early Ampeg amplifiers were tube designs. This was 1949, and the transistor, while recently invented, had not yet reached the commercial market in form suitable for audio amplification. Vacuum tubes were the technology of the era, and Hull's engineers designed around them with competence and care. The amplifiers were not spectacular-looking products. They were practical, workmanlike boxes built to do a specific job well. But the job they did better than anything else available. Hull's company grew in the only way that small instrument companies grow in their early years, slowly, through reputation, through word of mouth in tight communities of musicians who compare notes with each other, the way mechanics compare notes about tools. If an Ampeg bass amplifier held up on a tour, if it delivered the same sound in the third city as it had in the first, if it could be repaired on the road when something failed, these were the things that mattered to working musicians, and these were the things that Hull's products consistently delivered. By the early 1950s, the Ampeg Bass Amp Company had established itself in the professional music community. It was not yet famous. It was not yet the cultural institution it would become. But it had built a foundation of trust with exactly the audience that would carry it forward. The problem of moving sound. There is a logistical problem at the center of every working musician's life, and it is a problem that the music industry spent most of the 20th century pretending was someone else to solve. The problem is portability. An amplifier is, by physical necessity, a heavy and awkward object. It contains a power transformer, a dense coil of copper wire wound around an iron core that steps down the voltage from the wall and supplies the operating power for the amplifier's circuits. It contains output tubes, glass envelopes filled with metal components heated to hundreds of degrees, held in fragile ceramic sockets, surrounded by wire that runs at voltages that can kill a person if touched incorrectly. And it contains a speaker cabinet, typically a large wooden enclosure housing one or more speaker drivers, the size and construction of which directly determines how the low-frequency sound is reproduced. A bass amplifier adds complexity to each of these requirements. The power transformer has to be larger because bass frequencies demand more sustained power than guitar frequencies. The output tubes have to run at higher power levels for the same reason. And the cabinet has to be larger, significantly larger, because the physics of low-frequency sound reproduction demands enclosures with more internal volume and more speaker surface area than guitar cabinets require. In the 1950s, if you were a working bassist playing a club or a hotel ballroom, getting your amplifier to the gig meant dealing with all of this. The head unit, containing the electronics, was one heavy box. The speaker cabinet was a second heavy box. You loaded them into a car, carried them into the venue, positioned them on the stage, ran a cable between them, and hoped that nothing had been damaged in transit. Everett Hull thought there was a better way. The B-15 Portaflex, engineering as empathy. In 1960, Ampeg introduced a product that changed the relationship between working bass players and their amplifiers. They called it the Portaflex. The specific model was the B-15. The concept behind the Portaflex was architectural. Instead of building a separate head unit and a separate cabinet as two disconnected objects, Hull's engineers designed the amplifier so that the head unit, the chassis containing all the electronics, could fold down into the top of the speaker cabinet for transport. The cabinet itself had a hinged top panel. When you were loading in or loading out, you tilted the chassis down into the enclosure, closed the lid, and you had one object instead of two. When you arrived at the gig, you opened the lid, tilted the chassis back up into its operating position, plugged in, and played. This is the part of the description that sounds simple, but represents a profound piece of engineering. To make this work, the chassis had to be designed so that its weight distribution, when tilted forward, did not stress the hinges beyond their tolerance. The speaker cabinet had to be designed with a specific internal volume that accounted for the chassis occupying part of it in transit position. The ventilation of the amplifier had to work correctly, whether the chassis was tilted back at its operating angle or folded down for storage. Every mechanical and thermal constraint had to be solved simultaneously. They solved them. But the Portaflex's significance was not only mechanical. The B-15 had a second design innovation that came to define its sonic character and, eventually, its cultural legacy. The cabinet used a folded baffle design, a specific internal partition arrangement that directed the bass frequencies from the back of the speaker driver through a path inside the enclosure before releasing them from the front. This folded path added acoustic loading to the bass end of the speaker's response, extending the low-frequency reproduction downward in a way that a simple open baffle or sealed enclosure of the same physical size could not match. The result was a sound, not a specification, not a measured frequency response, not a watts per channel figure. A sound. A specific, identifiable character that musicians who played through B-15s began to describe in the only language available for such things. Analogies, metaphors, comparisons to other sounds they had heard. It was round, they said. It had body. It was warm in the mid-range without being muddy. It responded to touch. If you dug in with your fingers or your pick, the sound opened up. If you lightened up, it cleaned up. It breathed. In 1962, Ampeg updated the B-15 and made a cosmetic decision that, 40 years later, would become one of the most recognizable visual signatures in the history of electric instrument amplification. They covered the cabinet in blue check vinyl. The pattern was simple, a blue and silver checked vinyl covering that wrapped the corners and the flat surfaces of the cabinet. It was not a revolutionary design decision. Other manufacturers were covering their cabinets in vinyl at the time. The material was practical, durable, and easier to clean than Tolex or tweed. The blue check pattern was just a pattern. But the combination of that specific pattern with the specific sound of the B-15 meant that in the recording studios of the 1960s, in the jazz clubs and the television studios, and the hotel ballrooms where working bassists carried their Portaflexes, the blue check became a visual shorthand for a certain kind of bass sound. When you saw the blue check, you knew what you were hearing. And what you were hearing was, increasingly, the sound of the bottom end of American popular music. The Motown connection was not incidental. The in-house bassists at Motown, the musicians who played on the recordings that defined American popular music for most of the 1960s, played through Ampeg. The bass lines of "What's Going On," "Ain't Too Proud to Beg," "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," lines played by musicians like James Jamerson, arguably the most influential bassist in the history of recorded music, were captured through equipment that Ampeg built. When Jamerson played, the amplifier that translated his fingers on the strings into electrical signal was in the family of sound that Hull had designed. This is the kind of cultural debt that cannot be overstated and is almost never acknowledged in the official history of popular music. The bass lines that defined Motown were not the product of Motown alone. They were the product of the intersection between a musician of extraordinary talent and the physical equipment that translated that talent into sound that a microphone could capture, that an engineer could commit to tape, and that listeners could hear on the radio. The equipment mattered. The amplifier mattered. The B-15, with its folded baffle and its blue check vinyl, was not a neutral conduit. It was a participant. Carol Kaye, the Los Angeles session bassist, who played on an estimated 10,000 recordings in the 1960s, who provided the bass lines on records ranging from "Good Vibrations" by the Beach Boys to the theme from Kojak, used an Ampeg. Chuck Rainey, who played bass on Aretha Franklin's records at Atlantic, used an Ampeg. The bottom of American popular music, in studio after studio, in city after city, was arriving at the microphone through equipment that Everett Hull had designed in New York in the 1940s. It would be incomplete to discuss Ampeg's rise without accounting for the jazz world that Hull had originally built the company to serve. By the mid-1960s, jazz bass had undergone its own revolution. The electric bass guitar, introduced by Fender in 1951 and widely adopted through the late 1950s, had made the upright bass increasingly rare in working bands, not because the upright sounded worse, but because the electric bass was lighter, more portable, and produced a more consistent sound in live settings without the feedback problems of an amplified acoustic instrument. Ampeg adapted. The company that had built its first product for upright bassists began to build amplifiers for electric bass players, a shift that required adjustment in the design of the circuits and cabinets, but not in the fundamental philosophy. Hull's engineers were designing for bass. Whether the bass was an upright or a Fender Precision was a detail of implementation, not of purpose. The jazz world adopted Ampeg because the company had established its reputation there, and the quality of the equipment was real. But it was the rock and roll and rhythm and blues communities that would take Ampeg from a respected niche manufacturer to an industry-defining brand. And the man who built the company, the man who had designed everything from the converted end-pin peg to the Portaflex, did not like rock and roll. This fact is not incidental to the story. It is, in some ways, the hinge on which the entire tragedy turns. By the late 1960s, music had outgrown the rooms it had been designed to fill. In 1965, the Beatles played Shea Stadium, 55,000 people in an outdoor venue, the largest concert audience in history at that point, and the four men on the stage were running through equipment designed for clubs. The sound system, if it could be called that, was hopelessly inadequate. People in the back rows heard almost nothing. People in the front rows heard everything at once, a wall of undifferentiated noise in which no individual instrument could be isolated and appreciated. After Shea Stadium, the concert industry began to change. The venues got larger. The concerts moved outdoors. Festivals became a format, not just a novelty, but a commercial infrastructure, a way to aggregate tens of thousands of paying attendees in a single location and extract revenue from the scale. And the music had to fill these spaces. Guitar amplifiers adapted first, with manufacturers building increasingly powerful stacks, multiple amplifiers feeding multiple cabinets, towers of equipment that produced the sheer acoustic volume that a 50,000-person outdoor venue demanded. Jimi Hendrix was stacking Marshall cabinets. The Who were running through Marshall stacks that their roadies had to scaffold together. The visual language of rock and roll was being written in walls of amplifiers 8 feet high, speaker grills from floor to ceiling, a phalanx of equipment that communicated power before a single note was played. But the bass had a specific problem. Low-frequency sound requires more power to produce at equivalent perceived volume than high-frequency sound. The physics of this is not intuitive, but is absolute. To project bass frequencies across a large outdoor space at a volume that a listener at the back of the audience can feel as well as hear, you need substantially more power than a guitarist needs to project the same perceived volume at the same distance. A guitar amp that drives a guitarist's sound to the back of an arena might need 100 watts. A bass amp capable of matching that presence across the same distance might need 300. In the mid-1960s, no bass amplifier produced 300 watts. Not one. The technology did not exist in a form that was reliable enough to take on tour. Bill Hughes, an engineer at Ampeg, understood this problem. He had been working at the company long enough to understand what working musicians needed and what the existing technology could and could not do. He began designing an amplifier that would solve the arena problem. The super vacuum tube. The amplifier that Hughes designed was not subtle in any of its dimensions. It used 66146B output tubes, each one a glass envelope the size of a large fist, containing a metal plate structure running at several hundred volts, arranged in 3 parallel pairs, each pair operating in push-pull configuration. The combined output of these tubes, run through a purpose-designed output transformer that Hughes specified to handle the sustained low-frequency power demands of bass frequencies, produced approximately 300 watts of continuous output power. 300 watts. From vacuum tubes, in 1969. To put this in perspective, the Marshall 100-watt stack, the amplifier that defined the sound of rock guitar in the late 1960s, and that Hendrix and Clapton and Page ran through on stages across 2 continents, produced 100 watts. The Hughes amplifier produced 3 times that. And it was designed not for guitar, which could be managed at lower power levels with careful microphone placement, but for bass, which needed that power to reproduce its lowest frequencies at stage volume without the circuits collapsing under the load. Ampeg called it the SVT, the super vacuum tube. The name was functional, not poetic. It described what the amplifier was: a vacuum tube design operating at a power level that no vacuum tube bass amplifier had previously reached. But over the years, the name SVT would accumulate meaning far beyond its technical description. It would become shorthand for a specific kind of bass tone, muscular, full, present, with a mid-range character that sat in a band mix the way a supporting column sits in a building, invisible when it is working correctly, catastrophically obvious when it is not. And it would become shorthand for a specific kind of relationship between a bass player and their equipment, a relationship defined not by convenience or efficiency, but by a refusal to compromise. On August 15th, 16th, and 17th of 1969, at a farm in Bethel, New York, the Woodstock Music and Art Fair took place. The logistics of Woodstock are already legendary. The traffic, the rain, the mud, the 500,000 people who overwhelmed every system that the organizers had put in place, the acts that played through the night and into the morning because the schedule had long since dissolved. What is less remembered and more relevant to this story is what happened backstage in the hours before Sly and the Family Stone took the stage. Sly Stone needed more bass than any PA system at Woodstock could provide. His music, a genre-defying fusion of funk, rock, soul, and gospel that was unlike anything else being performed at the festival, was architecturally dependent on bass. Without the low-frequency foundation, the music did not exist, and the festival's sound system, improvised and overwhelmed, was not going to provide it. The SVT was brought in. Sly Stone's bassist, Larry Graham, who had developed the technique of slapping the bass strings against the fretboard to produce a percussive pop, a technique that would define funk bass for the next half-century, ran his signal through the SVT. When the band took the stage in the early morning hours of August 17th, the sound that came out of the equipment was something the crowd had not heard before. Not just loud, present. The bass was in the air, in the ground, in the chest cavity of every person standing in the field. It was a physical force. The SVT had announced itself. John Entwistle of The Who, a bassist whose tone was so aggressive and present that Keith Moon had to play harder to be heard above it, began using the SVT. Paul McCartney, whose bass playing had grown from the melodic support of early Beatles records into the complex independent voice of Abbey Road, used Ampeg equipment. The SVT became the stage amplifier that serious touring bassists demanded when other options would not do. By the end of 1969, Ampeg had built something that no other company in the world had built, an amplifier capable of powering bass in the largest live music venues on Earth, designed well enough to do it reliably night after night across an international tour, and distinctive enough in its sonic character that musicians who played through it sought it specifically rather than using it by default. The SVT was not the only Ampeg product. The B-15 Portaflex continued in production, continued to be the choice of studio bassists and jazz musicians, continued to define the sound of recorded bass in rooms where loudness was less important than tone. But the SVT was the amplifier that elevated Ampeg from a respected brand to a legend. Here is the detail that changes everything. Everett Hull did not like rock and roll. He was a jazz musician. He had built his company to serve the specific needs of the upright bass player in the jazz idiom, the player who valued subtlety, control, harmonic complexity, the understated art of holding together a rhythm section without calling attention to itself. The amplified end-pin pickup that he had designed in his apartment was not designed for Paul McCartney to use on a Beatles tour. It was designed for a session musician in a New York hotel ballroom trying to be heard over the drummer without triggering feedback. Rock and roll, as it developed through the 1960s, represented everything that Hull had not built his company for. It was loud. It was aggressive. It celebrated exactly the kind of raw, physical energy that jazz aesthetics considered crude. And it was making Ampeg famous. The SVT existed because rock music had created a demand for power levels that no previous bass amplifier had been built to provide. The cultural status that Ampeg was accumulating, the association with Sly Stone and John Entwistle and the largest stages in the world, was the product of a music that Hull personally found distasteful. This is not a small irony. It is the central irony of the Ampeg story. The founder's aesthetic values and the source of his company's greatest success were in direct opposition. And that opposition was not something that could be managed indefinitely. In the fall of 1967, a company called Unimusic acquired more than 50% of Ampeg's stock. Hull remained as president. The ownership had changed, but the daily operations were his to manage. For a while, this arrangement held together. Unimusic was not an instrument company. It was a corporate entity looking for market positions rather than a buyer with a particular vision for what Ampeg should become. And its involvement was, at first, more passive than active. But the culture of a company changes when its ownership changes. The people who write checks are the people who ultimately determine direction. And the direction that Unimusic's ownership implied, continued growth, continued expansion into the rock market that was providing Ampeg's commercial momentum, was not the direction that Hull had built the company to travel. Top officials began to leave. The institutional memory of the company, the engineers and product developers who had been with Hull from the early years, who understood not just how to build the products, but why they had been designed the way they had, began to thin out. The decisions that get made in those circumstances are often reasonable-sounding decisions that, accumulated across months and years, add up to the slow erasure of what made the company worth building in the first place. In the fall of 1968, Everett Hull resigned. He had watched his company acquired by an entity that did not share his values. He had watched the music he was serving move further and further from the jazz idiom he had started in. He had watched people he had worked with for years leave, one by one, as the culture shifted. And at some point, the gap between what Ampeg was and what he had intended it to be became wide enough that bridging it no longer seemed worth the effort. He walked away. There was no announcement, no retirement ceremony, no testimonial dinner, no industry tribute. The man who had invented the Ampeg pickup, who had founded the Ampeg Basamp company, who had designed the Portaflex, who had cultivated the engineering team that would create the SVT, that man simply stopped coming to the building. The company that carried his invention's name continued without him. For a while, it continued well. The engineers who had developed the SVT were still there. The manufacturing infrastructure in Linden, New Jersey, was still producing. The reputation was intact. But without the founder's obsessive attention, without the specific, irrational, deeply personal investment that founders bring to their companies, the investment that cannot be replicated by professional management, no matter how competent, a company begins, almost imperceptibly, to drift. In 1971, Unimusic sold Ampeg to Magnavox. Magnavox was, at the time, a major American consumer electronics manufacturer. It made televisions. It made radios. It made the kind of hi-fi components that sat in American living rooms. Receivers, turntables, the domestic infrastructure of recorded sound consumption. It had recently acquired Selmer, a musical instrument brand, and Ampeg was folded into that same division. Think about the institutional logic of this transaction. Magnavox was a company whose engineers spent their professional lives thinking about the physics of picture tubes and the engineering of consumer-grade audio components designed to sit on a shelf in a living room and reproduce the FM radio signal or the output of a turntable. These engineers were competent. They understood electronics. But their understanding was oriented toward a completely different set of problems than the ones Ampeg's products were built to solve. A Magnavox television engineer in 1972 understood how to manage the signal path from an antenna input to a CRT screen. What they did not understand, what could not be transferred by acquisition, was why the Portaflex B15's folded baffle produced the specific low-frequency bloom that James Jamerson's Motown sessions had been built around. They did not understand why the SVT's output transformer had been wound to the specific specifications that Bill Hughes had established through months of listening tests and measurements. They did not understand what was at stake in those specifications. In 1972, Magnavox dissolved Ampeg's incorporation. The company that had operated with its own legal identity, its own culture, its own institutional memory, ceased to exist as a legal entity. Management was moved to the Selmer Magnavox offices in Elkhart, Indiana. Elkhart, Indiana was, and remains, a significant center of musical instrument manufacturing. Band instruments, woodwinds, brass instruments, orchestral equipment. But it was not the world that Ampeg had come from. Moving Ampeg's management from New York to Elkhart was not simply a change of geography. It was a change of context, of community, of the professional culture in which the people making decisions about Ampeg products were embedded. In 1974, Magnavox closed the factory in Linden, New Jersey. The Linden plant was where Ampeg amplifiers had been built, not on an assembly line designed for consumer electronics, built by craftsmen who understood what they were making, who had institutional knowledge that was not written in any manual, who knew from experience what a correctly assembled SVT felt like versus one that had been assembled incorrectly at any one of 100 decision points along the way. When a factory closes, that knowledge does not transfer to the new facility. It disperses. The workers find other jobs. They move on. Some retire. Some carry pieces of what they knew into different contexts where it is only partially applicable. But the specific combination of knowledge and practice and tacit understanding that exists in a functioning manufacturing operation, that combination does not survive the closure. Production was moved to a portion of a Magnavox electronics factory in Tennessee. The change was framed internally as a practical decision. Excess production capacity at the Tennessee facility could absorb Ampeg's manufacturing, reducing overhead and improving efficiency. This framing was correct in purely financial terms. It was catastrophically incorrect in terms of what it did to the products. Guitarists and bassists who played through Ampeg amplifiers made in the Linden factory and compared them to amplifiers made in the Tennessee facility, after 1974 began to notice differences, not dramatic differences, not the kind of differences that show up in a specification sheet or a measurement report, but differences in feel, in the way the amplifier responded to a playing attack, in the way it behaved at the edge of its power, the specific quality of the compression and the character of the harmonic saturation that happened when a bassist pushed the SVT hard. In 1978, Bill Hughes, the engineer who had designed the SVT, left Ampeg. With Hughes's departure, the last person with a deep, first-hand understanding of why the SVT sounded the way it sounded was gone from the building. The circuit diagrams remained, the specifications remained, but the living knowledge, the understanding that informed decisions about component selection, about the relationship between the specifications and the sound, about what to do when a production sample deviated from the reference, that knowledge left with the man. In 1980, Ampeg was acquired by Music Technology, Inc., known as MTI. MTI was a wholesaler. It imported amplifiers from Japan and keyboards from Italy and distributed them through the American market. It was not a company with a founding obsession about bass amplification. It was a company that understood distribution channels and margin structures and the logistics of moving product from overseas manufacturers to American retail. Under MTI, SVT production moved to Japan. The circuit was, in principle, the same. The output topology, 6 output tubes in 3 parallel push-pull pairs running through an output transformer designed to handle sustained low-frequency power, was preserved. The specifications were, on paper, reproduced. But the same circuit, built in a different factory by different workers, with different components from different suppliers, in a different manufacturing culture, does not produce the same amplifier. This is not mysticism. It is the practical reality of what specifications capture and what they do not capture. A specification describes the measurable properties of a design, the resistance values of components, the capacitance of capacitors, the inductance of transformers. It does not describe the relationship between those properties and the subjective experience of playing through the amplifier. It does not capture why the original transformer was wound to those specifications, what listening tests, what compromises, what insights about the relationship between low-frequency transient behavior and the physical sensation of bass in a musician's chest informed that specific inductance value. Musicians who played through the MTI-era SVTs noticed the difference. The amplifiers were functional. They were loud, as the SVT had always been loud. But something in the response, the specific quality of how the amplifier behaved dynamically, the way it breathed with a player's attack, the specific character of the mid-range, was different enough to matter to the people who had built their playing style around the sound of the originals. MTI eventually declared bankruptcy. The company that had moved the SVT to Japan folded, leaving Ampeg's brand in limbo and its equipment in warehouses. In 1985, St. Louis Music acquired Ampeg. St. Louis Music was different from the previous corporate owners. It was an instrument company with people who understood what bass players needed and why the brand they had acquired mattered. They understood that the value of Ampeg was not simply a trademark and a catalog. It was a relationship with a community of musicians who had built their professional identity around the sound that the brand had originally produced. Under St. Louis Music, American production was restored. The SVT was brought back to the United States. The manufacturing process was rebuilt with people who understood what they were building. In 1987, St. Louis Music made 500 limited edition SVTs by hand. They used stockpiled original components that had been produced to the specifications that Hughes and his team had established, that had been sitting in storage during the MTI years. Each amplifier was serialized with a brass plaque. Each was built to the 1969 specification, the specification of the original SVT that had appeared at Woodstock and on stages across the world for the decade that followed. 500 amplifiers, a number small enough to make each one precious, large enough to reach the musicians who needed them. It was a statement that someone still understood what the SVT was supposed to be. It was also an acknowledgement, implicit but unavoidable, that the intervening 15 years had produced amplifiers that were something other than that. In 1995, St. Louis Music reissued the B15N Portaflex with the original blue check vinyl, the folded baffle, the tilt-back chassis, the specific acoustic character that Jamerson and Rainey and Kay had found at the heart of American studio bass sound for a decade. It was back, not original, not the same hands, but recognizable. Honest, in the way that a reproduction can be honest when it commits fully to the intention of the original, rather than approximating it for convenience. For 20 years, St. Louis Music held the name with something approaching care. The amplifiers they produced were not the originals, but they were made by people who understood why the originals had mattered and who were trying to honor that understanding in the product. In 2005, Loud Technologies acquired St. Louis Music, and Ampeg came with it. Loud Technologies was a professional audio company. Its flagship brand was Mackie, the manufacturer of mixing consoles and powered speakers that had become standard equipment in live sound production. Loud also owned EAW and Martin Audio, companies whose products lived on the touring side of the music industry, in the PA systems that front-of-house engineers built for arenas and outdoor festivals. Ampeg fit this portfolio in theory. Bass amplification was professional audio. The musicians who used SVTs and Portaflexes were the same musicians who worked in the same venues where Mackie consoles and EAW speakers were deployed. The customer communities overlapped. In practice, the culture of professional live sound production sits uneasily alongside the specific, historically loaded obsessions of the bass player community. A live sound engineer is, professionally, interested in the most reliable and transparent reproduction of the signal they are handed. A bass player who insists on an original 1969 SVT, who refuses to accept that a current production model sounds good enough because good enough is not the point, is operating according to a different set of values. The values are not irrational, but they are not the values of a professional audio company. Loud Technologies did not ruin Ampeg. The amplifiers continued. The SVT remained in production. The B15 Portaflex reissue continued. The brand maintained its market presence. But Loud was itself eventually absorbed by Transom Capital Group, a private equity firm. And in the moment that private equity enters the ownership chain of a brand like Ampeg, the nature of the relationship between the brand and its owners changes in a way that is subtle but absolute. Private equity firms are not instrument companies. They are not bass players. They are not even audio engineers. They are financial entities whose professional purpose is to acquire assets, manage them to improve their financial performance, and exit the investment at a profit within a defined time horizon. The time horizon is the key variable. It is typically 5 to 7 years. When the clock runs, the question is not whether a given brand will be sold. The question is when and to whom. On May 10, 2018, Loud Audio announced the sale of Ampeg to Yamaha Guitar Group, Inc. Yamaha Guitar Group is a wholly owned subsidiary of Yamaha Corporation of Japan, the company headquartered in Hamamatsu that is one of the world's largest musical instrument manufacturers, producing everything from classical guitars and grand pianos to marine engines and snowmobiles. The announcement was made in the language of corporate optimism. Ampeg is arguably the most recognized bass amp brand in the world, said Marcus Ryle, co-president of Yamaha Guitar Group. They can even be credited with having invented the first bass amp. We are honored to take the baton in continuance of that legacy. The language is worth examining. Take the baton. As though the Ampeg story were a relay race in which each owner hands off to the next without breaking stride, and the runner who receives the baton is equally capable of completing the leg. As though the transition from Loud to Yamaha were simply a change of baton holder, with the race continuing at the same pace on the same course toward the same finish line. But legacy is not a baton. You cannot hold it in one hand and pass it to the person behind you while running. A legacy is not a transferable object. It is the accumulated meaning of specific acts, specific decisions, specific moments in which people with specific values chose to do something one way rather than another way, and that choice proved, across years and decades, to have mattered. Everett Hull naming his pickup the Ampeg was such a moment. Bill Hughes spending months on the output transformer specification for the SVT was such a moment. The Woodstock performance, the Motown sessions, the Beatles tours. These were moments in which the equipment intersected with music that changed everything, and the equipment's particular character was part of what made that intersection produce the result it produced. Yamaha Guitar Group is a competent company. Its engineering is serious. Its manufacturing infrastructure is sophisticated. The Ampeg products that Yamaha produces are well made in the ways that well-made products can be measured: consistency, reliability, specification, accuracy. The SVT is in production. The Portaflex reissue continues. If you need an Ampeg amplifier today, you can purchase one, and it will function as its specifications describe. But Yamaha Guitar Group operates out of Calabasas, California. It is a subsidiary of a company whose headquarters is in Japan. The chain of command that determines what an Ampeg amplifier is, what decisions are made about its circuits, its components, its construction, runs from a product development team in California up through layers of corporate structure to a Japanese parent company whose primary identity is not bass amplifier. It is one of the world's largest musical instrument and electronics conglomerates. Trace the distance from start to finish. A man in a New York apartment attaches a pickup to the end pin of his bass and calls it the Ampeg. 72 years later, the company that name became belongs to a Japanese corporation known for pianos and marine engines, headquartered in a California city that did not exist when Hull made his first prototype. At every step of that journey, someone made a defensible decision. At every step, the transaction made sense in the terms in which it was evaluated. And at every step, what the company was moved incrementally further from what it had started as. There is a B-15 Portaflex in a recording studio in Nashville with a 1963 production date stamped inside the chassis. The original Jensen speaker has been replaced once. The output tubes have been replaced twice, with period-correct equivalents sourced from old stock. The blue check vinyl on the cabinet is worn through at the corners, where road cases have pressed against it across decades of sessions. The tilt-back hardware still works. The hinges that allow the chassis to fold down into the cabinet for transport, the mechanism that was Hull's specific answer to the specific problem of a working musician loading in and loading out, still operate correctly. When you plug a bass into this amplifier and bring the volume up past the midpoint, the cabinet breathes. There is a low-frequency bloom at the bottom of a note that spreads slightly as the note sustains. A three-dimensional quality in the bass reproduction that engineers who have worked with this amplifier for years describe as warmth or depth or simply presence. No current production amplifier has fully replicated it. Not because the circuit is secret, the schematics are available, the component values are documented, but because the combination of that specific chassis, that specific enclosure, and 60-plus years of exactly that kind of use has produced something that cannot be manufactured. It can only be accumulated. The musicians who still use this amplifier on recording sessions in Nashville know what they are using. They know its history. They know that the circuit it contains was designed by engineers who worked for a man who built the company around a specific philosophy about what bass players deserve to hear. They know that this particular amplifier has been on sessions that most people in the music industry would recognize. And they know that what it produces is not just a functional equivalent of a current production model. It is a different thing because it comes from a different place. There is an SVT on the stage of almost every arena concert that you have attended in the past 50 years. Not necessarily the same model, not necessarily the same vintage, but an SVT, an Ampeg SVT of some era, in some configuration, feeding some arrangement of speaker cabinets, is present backstage or in the monitor world, or directly on the stage at a frequency that no other bass amplifier approaches. The SVT became, over the decades following its 1969 introduction, the default standard against which every other bass amplifier was measured. If you wanted something different, you specified what you wanted. If you did not specify, you got the SVT. This is not purely a function of marketing or of brand loyalty in the sentimental sense. It is a function of trust built through performance in conditions that test equipment to its limits. The SVT earned its position in the touring professional world by doing the job, by producing the power levels that bass requires in large venues, by doing it reliably across the night-after-night punishment of an international tour, by behaving consistently when a given player had built their technique around how this specific amplifier responded. The SVT in its current Yamaha-era incarnation is not the same as the 1969 original. This is not a sentimental observation or a reflexive resistance to change. It is simply accurate. The output tubes are 655Os rather than the 6146Bs of the earliest models. The transformers are manufactured to specifications derived from the originals, but not identical to them. The construction methods reflect the manufacturing infrastructure of the current era. And yet, the SVT that Yamaha Guitar Group produces today will move air. It will provide 300 watts of tube power. It will sit in a band mix in the specific way that makes a bassist feel heard rather than merely present. The fundamental engineering decisions that Bill Hughes made in 1969 are embedded deeply enough in the design that they persist through the manufacturing changes and the corporate transitions and the passage of time. Something of what Hull built and what Hughes designed and what a generation of touring musicians proved in the hardest possible environment, something of that remains. Not everything, not what was there at the beginning, but something. In the decades since the Linden factory closed, a specific community of musicians and technicians has sustained the original Ampeg legacy in a way that no corporate owner has ever managed. These are the people who maintain original B15S and SVTS, who source period-correct tubes from old stock in Eastern Europe and Japan, who understand the relationship between the capacitors in the power supply and the low-frequency headroom of the amplifier, Who can rebuild a vintage output transformer to original specification when the original fails? Who pass this knowledge between each other in the way that craft knowledge has always been passed, not through manuals, but through practice, through apprenticeship, through the specific transmission of understanding that requires one person showing another person how something actually works. The vintage Ampeg market is not a nostalgia market in the pejorative sense, the sense of people paying inflated prices for objects associated with a sentimental past. It is a market for tools that do a specific job better, in the estimation of the people who have compared them carefully, than the current alternatives. When a working professional bassist pays significant money for an original 1965 B15 in working condition, that transaction is not primarily emotional. It is an informed technical judgment about the relationship between the cost of the amplifier and the quality of the sound it produces. These musicians are the true custodians of the Ampeg legacy, not Yamaha Guitar Group, not Loud Technologies, not St. Louis Music, not Magnavox, not Unimusic. The musicians who understand what these amplifiers do and who use them because that understanding matters to how they work. They are the continuity. What Ampeg actually built. Step back from the ownership chain. Step back from the corporate transactions, and the factory closures, and the management relocations, and the Japanese manufacturing decisions. Step back far enough to see what was actually built. Everett Hull built a company around the idea that bass players deserved to be heard. This was not a self-evidently important idea in 1946. Bass players were, in the conventional wisdom of the era, the most invisible members of a band. They provided the harmonic foundation and the rhythmic lock that held everything together, and in exchange they received no credit, no spotlight, and an instrument that could not be reliably heard in the rooms where music was performed. Hull's answer, the electromagnetic pickup in the end pin, the amplifiers designed specifically for bass frequency characteristics, the Portaflex with its folded baffle and its folding chassis, was a response to that injustice. It said, "The sound at the bottom of music matters. The person producing it deserves the tools to produce it correctly. Here are those tools." The SVT said, "The sound at the bottom of music can fill an arena. The person producing it can be physically present to 50,000 people in an outdoor field without losing the tonal character that makes their instrument itself, rather than a generic low-frequency presence. Here is the equipment to do it." These were not commercial propositions. They were engineering expressions of a value system. And the value system produced results that 50 years of subsequent listening has confirmed. The bass lines produced with Ampeg equipment are among the most recorded, most heard, most beloved in the history of popular music. The Motown records, the Beatles records, the Woodstock performances, the 1,000 recording sessions in studios in New York and Los Angeles and Nashville and Detroit, where working bassists plugged into equipment that Hull's company made and produced the sounds that the songs needed. That is what Ampeg built, not a catalog of products, a sonic language. In a studio somewhere in Nashville, the 1963 B15 is still plugged into the wall. The session engineer brought it out this morning because the bass player wanted to try it. The bass player is 26 years old. He has never heard of Everett Hull. He knows the name Ampeg the way he knows the names of the other equipment in the room, as a category, as a reference point, as shorthand for a certain kind of sound that he has heard on the records he grew up listening to, without knowing where the sound came from. He plugs in. He plays a note. He adjusts the volume and plays another note. And then he stops. Something about the way the cabinet breathes under a held bass note. Something about the way the low end blooms slightly at the decay. Something that is not dramatic, not spectacular, not the kind of thing that announces itself. But that is right, in the specific, irreducible way that a thing can be right when it has been made with care by someone who understood exactly what they were trying to do. He looks at the engineer. The engineer nods. They record the session through the 1963 B-15. And somewhere in the recorded sound, in the low-frequency bloom and the warm mid-range character and the specific way the amplifier responds to the player's attack, there is a trace of what Everett Hull built. Not the corporate entity that bears the Ampeg name, not the Yamaha Guitar Group subsidiary, not any of the 6 owners that have held the trademark across the decades since Hull walked away from the building in 1968. The thing itself, the engineering, the philosophy that said, the sound at the bottom of music matters, and the people who produce it deserve tools made with care. That trace is in the recording. It will be in the next recording. It will be in the recordings made after the 1963 B-15 finally fails, if someone does the work to maintain it, and someone will. Bass frequencies are the heaviest things in music. They are the most demanding to reproduce, the most difficult to amplify cleanly, the most physically present when they are done correctly. They are the foundation that every other frequency rests on. Pull them out, and the music floats, unmoored, in the upper registers, where nothing has weight or consequence. Everett Hull understood this when he mounted his first pickup in a converted N-pin and called it the Ampeg. He understood it when he designed the Portaflex so that a working bassist could carry the means of being heard in a single box that folded into itself. He understood it when he cultivated the engineers who would build the SVT, the amplifier that would prove that bass could not only be heard, but felt, physically felt, across the largest outdoor stages in the world. The weight that Hull put into that founding understanding, the seriousness, the commitment, the refusal to treat the bass player as a secondary concern in a market organized around guitarists. That weight does not disappear when a company changes hands. It does not dissolve when a factory closes, or when manufacturing moves overseas, or when private equity sets a clock on the investment. It is in the music. Every record made with Ampeg equipment, every bass line recorded in a Detroit studio in 1965, or a New York studio in 1972, or a Nashville studio in 1983, every recording in which an Ampeg amplifier translated a bassist's intention into electrical signal that was committed to tape, carries that weight forward. The company was founded in 1946. It was sold in 1967, in 1971, in 1980, in 1985, in 2005, in 2018. At each transaction, something was lost. At each transaction, the distance between what the company was and what Hull had intended it to be grew wider by one more degree. And in every one of those years, in studios and clubs and arenas and rehearsal rooms across the world, bass players plugged into Ampeg amplifiers and played. And the sound that came out, warm, full, present, the specific acoustic character of a company built around the radical idea that the bottom deserved to be heard, entered the recordings and the performances and the musical memory of anyone who was listening. That sound is still here. The man who made it possible is gone. The company he built has changed hands 6 times and currently belongs to a Japanese corporation headquartered in California. The factory in Linden, New Jersey, where the Portaflexes were assembled by craftsmen who understood what they were building, has been something else for 50 years. But if you sit in the right studio, with the right amplifier, and the right engineer who knows what they are doing, if you plug in a bass and bring the volume up past the midpoint and play a note and hold it and listen to how the cabinet breathes around the decay, you will hear what Everett Hull built. Not the logo, not the brand, not the corporation, the thing itself. And that, in the end, is the only answer that has ever mattered to anyone who understood what they were listening for.